All right. Have a seat. It's really a pleasure to see so many friends, old and new here, and family members as well. This is one of the highlights of being president of this society, and that is to give the President's Justice Award. And tonight I have the distinct honor and pleasure of giving the ASC's 2010 President's Award for Distinguished Contributions to Justice to Andrew L. Sonner, Judge, Maryland Court of Special Appeals, 7 Appellate Circuit, Montgomery County, from November 1996 to July of 2004. Judge Sonner retired in 2004, but he's just as busy since then. Among his many career highlights, and I'm being highly selective here, Judge Sonner has been chair of the Maryland State Commission on Criminal Sentencing Policy from 1999 to 2003, chair of the Maryland State Drug and Alcohol Abuse Council in 2004. He began his public career as state's attorney for Montgomery County from 1971 to 1996. He's been a member of the Governor's Commission on Law Enforcement and the Administration of Justice from 79 to 82. He chaired the Criminal Justice Commission, Montgomery County, from 1985 to 87. He was a member of the Task Force on Sentencing and Intermediate Sanctions of the Cabinet Council on Criminal and Juvenile Justice in 1996. He served on the Maryland Commission on Criminal Sentencing Policy in 1996. Judge Sonner earned his BA at American University in 1957. He went on to law school at American University and earned his JD in 1963. He's a member of the American Bar Association, a member of the Maryland State Bar Association, and he's past chair of the Criminal Law and Practice Section Council. He's a member of the American Judicature Society. He's on the board of directors, Maryland State's Attorneys Association, and from 1971 to 1996, and he was president from 73 to 76. He's been a member of the advisory committee on the National Consortium on Violence Research, and that's when I had the pleasure of first meeting Andrew Sonner. He also has an academic career. He was an instructor at the American Academy of Judicial Education from 1970 to 76. He's been a lecturer at the American University School of Law. He's been a lecturer off and on, I take it, at the University of Maryland and also at Montgomery College. He's published numerous articles in professional journals. He's won the Distinguished Alumni Award from the American University School of Law. He's won the Robert C. Heaney Memorial Award from the Maryland State Bar Association. He was given the Certificate of Merit for Outstanding Contributions in the field of victims' rights and services by the Governor of Maryland. He won the Wasserstein Public Interest Fellowship Award from the Harvard University School of Law in 1992. I selected Andrew Sonner as my choice for the President's Award for Distinguished Contributions to Justice for all of the reasons you just heard. He's obviously had a very distinguished career, but also because I'd never met anyone on the bench who had Judge Sonner's appreciation for the role, the absolutely vital and important role of research in informing legal decision-making. He has been coming to our meetings for how long, Andy? Since the 1980s. We don't get a lot of judges attending our meetings, certainly with that degree of regularity. He is, in many ways, one of a kind, and I am so happy to present to you the 2010 ASC President's Distinguished Contributions to Justice Award recipient, Let me present to you Andrew L. Sonner.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be back here. I used to come when I had the state's attorney's office pay my way. After I retired, it now is a little bit too expensive, so I was very, very happy to get the invitation to come out here and find out that you were going to pay my airfare and for a night's allowed. But even more honored, even more fun than the honor, is coming back and seeing so many people that I had come to know over those many years that I was here. And was coming to these meetings. Let me just kind of tell you a little story about how that all began, is that as a young prosecutor, as first elected and had associated with police and with judges, and we all knew all about criminology and what works and what didn't work and what was good policy and so forth, and we didn't really like to be interfered with by academics. And so then I got a telephone call, I think it was probably from Al Bloomstein, to come and be on a panel at the National Academy of Sciences. And I went down, and there I met another lawyer, Reggie Walton, who some of you may know. He handled the Scooter Libby trial in Washington, D.C. not very long ago. And he and I were the two practical ones on the panel, and so we were pretty well assured that we could keep those criminologists straight. But after about the third meeting, I turned to him and said, these people know more about what we do than we know ourselves. And those were people like Al Reese, Al Bloomstein. One of the most interesting people that I ever met was Norval Morris. And not only was he brilliant, but what a raconteur, and just listening to his accent was a pleasure. And so I would have to say that over the next few years as a person in charge of policy in Montgomery County, Maryland, I attempted to try to marry policy with research and what the best practices were. And let me tell you, that is one difficult job. I remember reading an article by Joan Petersilia written with Al Bloomstein about why doesn't anybody pay attention to us? And I was one of those people who was earlier not paying attention. But then I was trying to get other people to pay attention to me because I was paying attention to them. And I would have to say I made some noble efforts. And some were successful, some weren't. But the one time that I really tried hardest was I finished reading a little book that was written for people like me that don't understand chi-squares and regression analysis and all that of this. It's called Malign Neglect, written by Michael Tonry. And that was kind of like Saul on the road to Tarsus. I was on the road to Damascus. I thought, you know, what I'm doing day in and day out as a prosecutor is really very, very destructive to the community in which I live, and we really do need to try to change the policy. And I made an attempt to do that. I'd have to say I fell flat in my face. I couldn't change the police. I couldn't change the corrections people to a degree, although they're easier to change than the police. And so the most that I could ever do was really try to adopt some of those teachings to exercising the discretion in the state's attorney's office. So and as a judge since then, I was appellate judge for a while, and now we call ourselves geezer trial judges. We are the over-the-hill judges that come back from time to time. And I will say that research from Michael Tonry and from others like Al Reese and so forth, it does ring to my head like a good teacher that you all may have teachers that still talk to you. Well, those teachers still talk to me, and I've attempted in the time that I have had the power to exercise authority to brighten the corner where I am. And so for that, I'm pleased to accept the award for somebody who tried with some success, but probably more failures that you all know more about than I. And as you try to confirm your research and turn that into practice, you run up against people like me. I just wish more of them could have the experiences that I've had of talking with you and learning from you over the past career. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure.
Thank you very much. On with the show. We don't need me up there. Okay. There you go. Throughout its brief history, criminology has swung back and forth between an emphasis on explaining individual criminal behavior and explaining patterns and trends in crime rates. But the pendulum never swings too far, especially in American criminology, from a preoccupation with individual criminality and the microenvironments, families, schools, and neighborhoods in which its putative causes are located. The current period, with its breakthrough studies of gene-environment interactions and individual development, epitomizes the dominance of microcriminology. In this paper, only a portion of which I will share with you this evening, I try to nudge the pendulum back the other way by highlighting the value for theory, research, and public policy of macrocriminology. I do not claim that knowledge of the cultural and social conditions that influence crime rates is to be preferred over knowledge of individuals in their immediate settings. I maintain simply that criminology would be better off with more systematic and sustained attention to the big picture. But is it true that microcriminology dominates the field? Consider a common response to macro-level studies of crime that fail to specify the micro-mechanisms linking properties of populations to the criminal behavior of individuals. Critics routinely push macro-analysts to identify the proximate causes of criminal behavior, those characteristics of the individual or milieu that trigger or restrain criminal propensities or acts. That is entirely appropriate criticism and advice. What's interesting, however, and an important signal of epistemological imbalance in our field, is how much less often microcriminologists are asked to explain individual behavior with reference to the cultural and structural features of a given society at a given moment in history. That is, to specify the ultimate causes of crime. When micro-researchers do situate individual criminal behavior in social contexts, the analysis often extends no further than the local census tract. Just as we rightly tell macro-researchers their studies are not complete until they fill in the proximate causes of criminal behavior, we should also encourage micro-researchers to link the study of individuals to the big picture. I use the term big picture to refer to the features of social systems associated with particular types and levels of crime. Social systems consist of those patterns of culture and social structure that distinguish social aggregates, typically whole societies, from one another. Cultural and structural patterns are in turn linked together by social institutions, the key analytic unit of macro-social analysis. With two key exceptions, big picture thinking is largely absent from contemporary criminology. The exceptions are the study of punishment in relation to political and economic institutions in the work of Garland, Gottschalk, Simon, and others, and the historical study of homicide in the work of Eisner, Roth, Sperenberg, and others. Valuable guidelines can be found in both areas for the development of big-picture criminology more generally. In this paper, I highlight the contributions of several theorists to big-picture social science and consider the data improvements needed to strengthen the policy relevance of macro-criminological theory and research. To set the stage, it's useful to consider the implied connection in contemporary microcriminology between individual criminal behavior and aggregate crime rates. If microanalysis holds sway in criminology today, It's also true that allusions to the big picture abound in current research, including studies of individual criminal and antisocial behavior. Micro-studies often, I should say typically, open with a statement that hooks the research to a critical public problem. Almost always, the problem is unacceptably high levels of serious crime. After that, however, the big picture disappears. Rarely do these papers return to the opening sentences on crime in populations and explain how better individual-level research and the policies based on it would reduce aggregate crime rates. The strong implication is that no such explanation is needed. But the link between individual differences in antisocial behavior and the crime rates of populations is not obvious, and to my knowledge has never been demonstrated. A hypothetical scenario is helpful for thinking through the steps needed to forge the connection. Suppose we had a pill that, when administered to highly antisocial children, reduced their subsequent crimes by 20% from the level expected without the treatment. Suppose further that these children constitute 5% of all future offenders, and if untreated, they would go on to commit 50% of future crimes. All else equal, the reduction in crimes attributable to the treatment would be 10%. That's a sizable impact, and the assumptions informing this thought experiment, a 20% effect size, 5% of the offenders committing 50% of the crimes, are in line with research on the effectiveness of the best early interventions and the pronounced skew in the commission of serious crime. This seems to be the kind of logic that, if explicated, underlies the implied connection between reducing the criminal propensities of individuals and reducing the aggregate crime rate. Now let's see what this logic assumes away. Crime is a function of both supply and demand factors. Studies of individual differences in criminal behavior focus almost exclusively on the supply side. The policy implication seems to be that reductions in the supply of offenders will lead to reductions in crime. This policy logic assumes away the demand for crime. But market-oriented crimes, which I will argue constitute the great majority of all serious crimes, are committed in response to consumer demand for the goods or services that criminals provide. Now, if the pro-social pill in our scenario were successful in reducing the eventual supply of criminal offenders, what would happen to the market for crime? A drop in supply should increase the price of illegal goods and services. As a result, demand might fall as well, but incentives for new suppliers to enter the market would increase given the higher returns to crime. Depending on the elasticity of demand and the strength of the price incentives, the initial reduction in the supply of offenders might or might not result in a decrease in the rate of market-oriented crime. Given the dynamic interplay of supply and demand forces in illegal markets, however, it's virtually certain that reducing the supply of criminal offenders will not produce a one-to-one drop in market crimes over the long run. This market analysis of crime, which Bushway and Reuter used to question the effectiveness of deterrent strategies in decreasing drug crimes, in my view applies in principle to all crimes committed in response to consumer demand, which includes most property crimes, violent crimes such as robbery, personal service crimes such as prostitution, in addition to drug selling. Nor does market analysis raise questions only about the impact of deterrent strategies. It is usefully applied to any crime reduction strategy that focuses solely on diminishing the supply of criminal offenders without taking into account the demand for crime. Two key questions about the efficacy of our hypothetical treatment for antisocial behavior are: one, whether the treatment will staunch the flow of new entrants to the criminal marketplace, and two, whether the treatment will reduce the demand for crime. With respect to the first question, the treatment might be very effective when administered to those willing to commit crimes at some given level of incentives. But what about those enticed into crime by greater incentives? That is, higher market returns per unit of effort. As Bushray and Reuter point out, criminal incentives are not constant. They shift up or down according to changing market conditions. Incentives to commit crime should increase as the supply of offenders decreases, as long as consumer demand for illegal goods and services does not fall as rapidly as the supply. The lure of higher returns to effort will bring into the market offenders unwilling to risk criminal activity with fewer incentives. By definition, these new entrants are more risk-averse than those they replace, and therefore less likely to fit the inclusion criteria for treatment. We could, of course, cast the treatment net more widely to capture those with lower tolerance for risk. But their market replacements would even be more risk-averse, and the treatment net would have to be widened accordingly. The supply of potential offenders is not inexhaustible, but as long as potential offenders differ in their response to incentives and preferences for risk, it will remain a moving target. And as long as the demand for illegal goods and services does not fall as rapidly as the supply of criminals willing and able to provide them, the aggregate rate of crime will remain high in relation to even the most effective treatments that target would-be serious offenders. But shouldn't we expect programs or treatments that effectively reduce the supply of criminal offenders to also cut the demand for crime? After all, those who buy illicit drugs or stolen merchandise are also breaking the law. Although it's difficult to tell, this would seem to be part of the implicit logic that connects aggregate crime rates to individual criminal propensities. That logic is subject to the same limitations of supply-side interventions when applied to the demand side of crime. If it is assumed that consumers of illegal goods and services, like the purveyors, differ in their response to incentives and risk preferences. As sellers are removed from the market, some consumers will drop out as prices rise. But as additional sellers are attracted into the market by higher returns, prices should stabilize or fall, increasing incentives for additional consumers to enter the market and putting upward pressure on aggregate crime rates. But there's an important difference between the suppliers and consumers of illegal goods and services that raises additional questions about the effectiveness of interventions that focus on current or future serious offenders. The consumers are far less likely to be serious offenders than the suppliers, even allowing for some overlap between the two populations. There are many more consumers of illegal goods and services than the drug dealers and robbers and burglars and thieves who supply the illegal markets. It follows that consumers are likely to be more heterogeneous with respect to the early life or more proximate risk factors for serious criminality, and therefore, on the whole, are less likely to be targeted by interventions that focus on poor parenting, educational or cognitive deficits, conduct disorder, gang involvement, or antisocial behavior. The marked skew we observe in serious criminal behavior probably does not characterize the distribution of demand in illegal markets. I doubt, for example, that 5% of marijuana users consume 50% of the marijuana. I hope not, anyway. Further, consumers of illegal goods and services face lower risks of apprehension and punishment than do the suppliers. Drug selling is riskier than drug possession. Frequenting prostitutes is not as risky as selling sex. The large size, considerable heterogeneity, and comparatively low risk that characterize the population of consumers of illegal goods and services place further drags on any demand reduction that can be accomplished by interventions that target serious offenders in the hopes of reducing aggregate crime rates. I've extended the market analysis of crime well beyond the market for illicit drugs, where economists have concentrated their attention, to encompass most property crimes, personal service crimes, and acquisitive violent offenses such as robbery. But does this analysis extend to other violent crimes? Serious violent offending is arguably the chief concern of psychologists and criminologists who study antisocial behavior and its early life antecedents. Even if our hypothetical treatment for antisocial behavior might not bring down rates of market-oriented crime, should it not lead to reductions in homicides, assaults, or other crimes to which considerations of supply, demand, and price do not apply? I think that individual treatment and interventions are likely to have a greater impact on violent crime than on property crime, but it would be a mistake to assume that violent crime is not also influenced by illegal markets. Violence is a potent enforcement mechanism, and violent crime rates are elevated in stateless social locations where formal, authoritative means of dispute resolution are unavailable, including illegal markets and the underground economies they service. It's difficult to determine the proportion of homicides and serious assaults that occur in such contexts, but one analysis shows that if only 2 of every 10,000 robberies, burglaries, and motor vehicle thefts resulted in a homicide, that would account for a sizable fraction of all homicides committed in the United States. Wherever illegal markets remain extensive and vibrant, we should expect aggregate rates of serious violence to remain high, quite apart from even the most successful efforts to prevent individual antisocial behavior. The study of individual differences in serious criminal behavior and the amelioration programs based on this research are showpieces of contemporary microcriminology at its very best. My questions and criticisms are directed only at the assumption of a straightforward connection between effective individual-level interventions and reductions in aggregate rates of crime. I want now to direct attention to some of the key foundations of macrocriminology. My thinking about the big picture has been influenced by many classical and contemporary theorists, and most certainly by my longtime collaborator and friend, Steve Messner. But Emile Durkheim, Talcott Parsons, Karl Polanyi, and C. Wright Mills contributed 4 indispensable planks to the foundation of the big picture that I wish to emphasize: the normality of crime, the structure of social institutions, the social control of markets, and the interplay of social structure and individual biography and history. Let's begin with Durkheim. Perhaps Durkheim's most profound contribution to criminology is the insight that crime is normal. Crime is normal because it's social, and it's every bit as social as conformity. It follows that every society has a normal rate of crime. That is, the crime rate expected when institutions operate much as they are supposed to. Every type of family system, every type of economy, political system, religious and educational system produces a normal crime rate. The interdependence among major social institutions, what Steve Messner and I have termed the institutional balance of power, in turn produces the normal crime rate of the social system. Durkheim offered little systematic guidance for establishing the normal crime rate, and some economists doubt that it can be demonstrated empirically, at least for the United States. Nonetheless, 3 important implications for criminological theory and research follow from the idea that crime is normal. First, if crime, in Durkheim's words, is, quote, bound up with the fundamental conditions of all social life, then its form and frequency should vary with changes in social conditions. Different societies, then, should have characteristically different patterns and levels of crime, as should the same society during different historical periods. A second consequence of the social normality of crime is that the crime rate can never be driven to 0. Even if a particular type of crime is extinguished, another type will take its place. To take perhaps the most obvious example, stealing horses is no longer prevalent in modern industrial societies, but stealing automobiles is. Another example, violent crime rates have fallen in most Western societies since the late Middle Ages, but rates of property crime have risen over the same period. In each instance, it took fundamental social changes. For example, new modes of transportation and economic organization to eliminate or reduce one type of crime and to foster the ascendancy of the other. A final implication of the social normality of crime is that crime rates can fall too low for the good of a society. This idea seems as curious, even pernicious, to present-day sensibilities as it did to Durkheim's readers a century ago. As Durkheim wrote, quote, "Crime must no longer be conceived as an evil that cannot be too much suppressed. There's no occasion for self-congratulation when the crime rate drops below the average level, for we may be certain that this apparent progress is associated with some social disorder." As an example, consider the low rates of robbery, burglary, and other forms of street crime that prevailed in the former Soviet Union. A garrison state can suppress street crime, but at great social cost. We might ask whether the crime suppression brought about by mass incarceration in the United States ought to be regarded in a similar light. The idea that crime is normal does not mean that high levels of crime must be tolerated as an inevitable and unchangeable fact of life. Rather, it directs attention to the social conditions that produce crime and suggests that efforts to reduce crime without altering the underlying crime-producing conditions may prove futile, costly, or both. If we accept the idea that crime is a normal feature of a social system that is itself functioning at normal or expected capacity, we must reject as utopian fantasy the possibility of a crime-free social system. But should we not then also reject social disorganization theories that attribute high rates of crime chiefly to malfunctions or breakdowns in social institutions? I do not think social disorganization theories are without value, but they leave open the important question of the amount of crime produced by well-functioning institutions. And as such, their explanations of crime are indeterminate. For how are we to know how much more crime is produced when institutions are behaving badly, without knowing how much crime is produced when they're behaving normally? To address in a more comprehensive way the role of social institutions in curbing the excesses of modern market economies, we need a conceptual vocabulary that defines social institutions, delineates their multiple and interdependent functions, and explains how the institutional configuration of modern societies exerts social control and promotes social order. For that, there's no better place to turn than to the work of Talcott Parsons. But really, who now reads Parsons? Talcott Parsons' opus has fallen on hard times, battered by criticisms of both its substance and its form. Many of the criticisms are valid. He overused the organic analogy in his conception of the interdependent workings of the social system, and he badly underestimated the significance of group conflict as a source of social change. There's a strong teleological bent to his later writing about social evolution that places the United States at the pinnacle of societal development. And as a stylist, he was no Shakespeare. But Parsons has had an enduring, if now often unnoticed, influence on contemporary social science. For our purposes, his most important legacy is his conception of the structure and functions of social institutions. Parsons used the concept of social institutions as an analytical device for addressing the problem of order in society. All societies, he argued, must meet 4 basic functional prerequisites if they are to persist over time. They have to adapt to the physical environment, mobilize resources to achieve collective goals, integrate the subparts of the society around common values, and maintain members' allegiance to the basic normative patterns. Social institutions carry out these basic functions, and institutions do not operate in isolation from one another. They are interdependent in the sense that the outputs of each, for example, economic goods or goal attainment or socialization, constitute the inputs necessary for the proper functioning of the others. This mutual give and take among institutions, through which each part contributes to the survival value of the whole, comprises the coherence and integrity of the social system. Now, Parsons may have exaggerated the degree of value consensus in American society, and he may have neglected the significance of internal contradictions in otherwise well-functioning societies. but he cannot be fairly accused of missing the macro forest for the micro trees. His insistence that a society must be analyzed as a whole to explain the operation of any specific subpart remains a critically important lesson for criminology today. Parsons also bequeathed to contemporary social science a definition of social institutions that retains great analytical value. An institution is at bottom a system of rules for governing the operation of social positions, the roles connected to them, and the organizations in which roles are enacted and goals are achieved. Therefore, institutions are not to be confused with the organizations that constitute their concrete manifestation in social life. Schools, private businesses, political parties, and churches are not institutions, common usage notwithstanding. They are the organizational manifestations of the institutions of education, the economy, the political system, and religion. The study of institutions tells us how organizations are supposed to function. An investigation of organizations reveals how institutions actually operate. A key analytical distinction, then, is between the structure of institutions, the nature of the rules themselves, and the observed performance or functioning of institutions, the degree to which organizations carry out their institutional mandates more or less faithfully. In his recent historical investigation of homicide, Randolph Roth links homicide increases not only to institutional breakdown, as when political institutions lose legitimacy, but also to historical and cross-national variation in institutional structures, in Parsons' sense. A good example involves homicides among adult relatives. In societies where kinship largely determines adult status, such as 18th century rural France, according to Roth, relationships among adult relatives are often explosive, and homicides among them run high. By contrast, homicides among adult relatives were scarce in colonial America. Given its open and flexible kinship system, rules of bilateral descent, an expectation that adults had to succeed largely on their own. Under these conditions, conflicts over resources and opportunities among siblings and between fathers and their adult offspring are less common and less likely to end in murder. Now, this institutional distinction and the corresponding differences in homicide are not a story of institutional dysfunction or disorganization. On the contrary, they exemplify how the institutional rules themselves produce a normal rate of crime. With the distinction between institutional structure and functioning in mind, we can revisit the restricted explanatory capacity of social disorganization theories of crime. Disorganization theorists fail to consider the crime produced by institutional structures and focus solely on the crime associated with institutional malfunctioning. They thereby confound to some degree the two analytically distinct sources of crime, which is why their explanations of observed crime rates are indeterminate and why they have no way of explaining crime rates that are too low. The possibility that observed crime rates may be too low follows directly from the idea of the normal crime rate and the distinction between institutional structure and functioning. Although I don't expect the National Institute of Justice to request proposals to study the problem anytime soon, the importance of lower than expected crime rates for criminological theory and research should not be overlooked. The problem of abnormally low crime rates in criminology is in principle no different than that of abnormally low unemployment or inflation rates in economics. Economists who study variation in unemployment and inflation do not compare the observed rates with zero, but with non-zero benchmarks set at levels deemed optimal for the workings of a given economy. Criminology is obviously nowhere near economics in evaluating observed crime rates with reference to the optimal or structural rates, but that should not prevent us from thinking hard about the amounts and types of crime that are built into the structure of social institutions. Parsons' conception of social institutions is very helpful in this respect, but it's not enough. He offers a valuable portrait of the social system, Now we need a moving picture that describes system dynamics as they have played out historically in the most dynamic system of all, the modern capitalist social order. For that, we turn to Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation. Prior to the emergence of market economies in the 18th and 19th centuries, according to Polanyi, the economy was firmly embedded in the kinship, political, and religious institutions of pre-modern societies. In short, the economy was subservient to society. Since the Industrial Revolution, we've come to think of the capitalist economy as characterized by self-regulating markets, operating according to their own internal logic. Polanyi insisted that the image of the capitalist economy as freed from the constraints of other institutions is a myth. But laissez-faire is an ideologically potent myth because it serves to justify opposition to any and all forms of market interference by either the defenders of the traditional institutional order or by advocates of democratic control over the economy. A purely self-regulating economy has never existed in history because such a lopsided and utopian institutional arrangement could never persist for long without destroying the very foundations of social order. To paraphrase Polanyi, human beings would soon perish if exposed directly and without social protection to pure market forces. Therefore, a counter-movement has accompanied the development of capitalism from the very beginning. The counter-movement seeks to impose order within the market economy, lest it destroy itself, and to protect society from unbridled market forces. Despite the centuries-old argument that a social order based on the logic of markets conforms to human nature itself, Polanyi held that there's nothing natural about laissez-faire economics. On the contrary, laissez-faire is a deliberate plan. What is natural and inevitable is that human beings will resist the utopian schemes of market ideologues and seek to bring markets under social control. The successive reforms to control the market and the varied forms the controls assume, fascism, communism, socialism, liberal democracy, are the driving forces of modern history. The history of modern societies then consists of the double movement of market capitalism and efforts to restrain or roll back its destructive mechanism. Polanyi did not dwell on the problem of the historical consciousness required of those who would contain the destructive forces of modern capitalism. But we might ask, what habit of mind is necessary to understand the seemingly impersonal movement of history, the possibilities for deliberate social change at a particular historical moment, and the interpenetration of self and society? That's the problem that C. Wright Mills takes up in the Sociological Imagination. Mills described the sociological imagination as a quality of mind and of social analysis that, quote, enables us to grasp history and biography and the relations between the two within society. It is the capacity, he continued, to range from the most impersonal and remote transformations to the most intimate features of the human self and to see the relations between the two. Mills held that society can never be reduced to what he called the scatter of individual minds and behaviors. At the same time, however, individuals are not the mere instruments of larger social forces. Individuals make choices from among socially structured alternatives. We cannot fully understand the choices available to individuals, which constitute the real possibilities of human freedom, or why particular choices and not others are made, according to Mills, if we limit our study of the social constraints on individual thought and action to the immediate social surround of family and local community. Adequate understanding, Mills wrote, requires that we grasp the interplay of these immediate settings with their larger structural framework, and that we take into account the transformations of this framework and the consequent effects upon milieu. I can think of no better example of this kind of broad structural analysis that is relevant to the study of crime than William Julius Wilson's account of how inner-city families and neighborhoods were buffeted and transformed by changes in the industrial structure of the American economy after World War II. Yet, too often, in the normal science of neighborhood criminology spawned by Wilson's work, study of the ultimate causes of community decline and disorder has retreated to the background and been replaced by narrow and mechanical assessments of the association between the crime rate and this or that feature of the local census tract, block group, or street segment. Here we have an object lesson in why the sociological imagination must be applied relentlessly in our work so that it does not give way to abstracted empiricism. Historical investigation, Mills said, is necessary to keep the sociological imagination alive and well. He called history the shank of social study. History is especially relevant when studying the relationship between the proximate social context of individual behavior and the more distant structural forces that shape them. Our chance to understand how smaller milieu and larger structures interact, and our chance to understand the larger causes at work in these limited milieu, Mills contended, require us to deal with historical materials. If historiography is an indispensable tool for exercising the sociological imagination in the study of crime, it also faces a huge challenge: the uneven or unknown quality and accuracy of the available historical data. Investigations of crime that extend back in time more than a few decades must contend with spotty records and the lack of uniformity in the classification and measurement of events. This is one reason why criminologists who might be otherwise inclined do so little historical research. Ironically, however, the lack of complete, uniform, and timely data is also a key reason why macrocriminologists have difficulty addressing crime problems as they are unfolding today. In closing, I want to consider the state of the infrastructure for big-picture studies of emergent patterns of crime. The aggregate crime rate, crimes per unit of population, is the bottom line of macrocriminology. Without it, there's nothing to explain. If macrocriminology is to be of some use in explaining variation in crime rates within and across populations, we need detailed and accurate data for constructing reliable crime rates. And if those explanations are to inform policy responses, the data must be timely. We cannot develop adequate policy responses to this year's crime rates with last year's crime data, not to mention policies to prevent future crimes. With the advent of the National Crime Victimization Survey and the supplementary homicide reports in the 1970s and the National Incident-Based Reporting System in the 1980s, the nation has taken large strides in enhancing the accuracy and detail in the crime data needed for research and in understanding the strengths and limitations of data based on crimes known to the police. But we've made almost no progress with respect to data timeliness. That's the issue I want to discuss here. The Uniform Crime Reports is disseminated annually about 9 months after the end of the collection year. The FBI published the final data for 2009, for example, in September of 2010. The publication of the NCVS is now on roughly the same schedule. There are good reasons for the time lag between the collection and dissemination of victimization statistics, which must be culled from ongoing field surveys of more than 38,000 households and 68,000 individuals. There's no excuse for the long delay in the dissemination of the UCR data compiled from local law enforcement agencies. We know that crime data can be disseminated more rapidly in some form because it already is. The FBI publishes detailed quarterly data on bank crimes by type of financial institution, the amount of loot taken, the amount recovered, type of weapon used, number, sex, race, and ethnicity of the perpetrators, the time of day and day of the week the crime occurred, and many other characteristics. And by UCR standards, the bank crime data are very timely. For example, data for the second quarter of 2010 were available on the FBI website in October of 2010. So if you're interested in tracking emerging patterns and trends in bank crimes in small time increments and using the results to guide policy interventions, these data are quite helpful. But if you want to develop comparable policy-relevant knowledge of, say, criminal homicide, unless the killing occurred during a bank robbery, you're out of luck. The FBI has actually taken several steps backward over time in promulgating the UCR data in the slender time increments needed for rapid policy response. When the program began in 1930, the data were released on a monthly basis. There's a copy of one of the early monthly UCR reports on the left. A quarterly release schedule was adopted in 1932, and it was only discontinued as a cost-saving measure during World War II. So here we are, well into the 21st century, when most law enforcement agencies compile crime data in electronic form, looking back in envy on the good old days of 1932, when the nation's crime statistics were released on a schedule that made them useful for tracking crime problems as they arose. We also know it's possible to disseminate the UCR data more rapidly than 21 months after the beginning of the collection year, because a large and growing number of local police departments already post monthly and in some cases weekly crime counts on their public websites. In addition, many UCR programs publish crime statistics well before they're made available by the FBI, state UCR programs, I should say. But the move to real-time data availability at the local and state level prompts two important questions. One, how accurate are the data disseminated on such a rapid basis? And two, if accurate and timely data are available from the local police department, why is that not sufficient for strategic and policy purposes? There's a trade-off between the timeliness and accuracy of crime data, just as there is with unemployment, home sales, consumer spending, and other economic statistics that are routinely released a month beyond the collection period. To ensure the long-term accuracy of the economic data series, the economic indicators are subject to continuous revision. Business, government, and the research community, however, are prepared to trade some short-term inaccuracy in economic data to facilitate timely policy development, adjustment, and evaluation. The release and revision of the nation's crime data should be guided by the same yardstick, and the trade-off between data quality and timeliness should be treated as an empirical question. How much accuracy would be sacrificed by releasing crime data in monthly or quarterly increments, 1 month after the collection period, compared with, say, 3 months or 6 months after collection? For which crime types, data categories, and reporting units would we experience the greatest loss in data quality? The answers to these questions can be used to inform judgments regarding what is and what is not an acceptable degree of short-run inaccuracy and lack of detail in crime data for effective policy response. And those policy judgments, in turn, should determine the temporal and spatial resolution and the release schedules for crime data that efficiently balance the competing demands for data quality and timeliness. But if the more rapid release of UCR crime data proves to be tenable, why is it necessary? After all, local police departments, especially the larger ones, are now capable of producing real-time data that can be used to address emerging crime problems. Rapid data collection and retrieval are the digital foundation for the hotspots and problem-oriented policing strategies now so much in vogue. So if the St. Louis or San Francisco Police Department has adequate data for monitoring and responding to local crime problems, what use would they have for comparable data from Cleveland or Chicago? We might ask the same question about the policy relevance of public health or economic data. If we already know the local heart disease or unemployment rate, for example, why do we care about the prevalence of heart disease or unemployment elsewhere? The answer, of course, is that the origins of heart disease and unemployment transcend local boundaries. The local conditions are manifestations of broader patterns and trends. The same is true of crime, although I suspect that is not a widely shared view, even among criminologists. but it does appear to be consistent with recent research on local crime trends. If local crime rates represent more or less predictable variations on a common theme, in other words, if they reflect a bigger picture, then the first task of the policymaker is to place the local changes in the context of general trends. Knowing whether local crime rates correspond with or diverge from broader patterns is essential for developing effective local responses. If local conditions are part of a general pattern, then interventions proven effective elsewhere should be high on the list of candidates for local adoption. If the local rates are diverging from common trends, it's a good bet they're being driven by idiosyncratic local conditions, for example, a flare-up in local gang conflicts, which would call for interventions specifically tailored to the local scene. In either case, comparative crime data are needed to determine the nature of local crime problems and to respond appropriately. I've argued that the UCR crime data should be made more timely, and that the availability of local data, no matter how current or accurate, does not substitute for the broad comparative data only the UCR provides. So a question comes up. Is the FBI up to the task of producing the data needed to better inform both local and national crime control policy? I have my doubts. The tepid nationwide implementation of NIBRs, the delays and cost overruns in updating their computer systems, and the low organizational priority assigned to the collection and dissemination of the UCR data are not encouraging signs that the agency is prepared to speed up data dissemination and conduct the research necessary to evaluate the sacrifice in data quality that might entail. In any event, other units in the Department of Justice are better suited for these purposes than the FBI, which, after all, and to be fair, is not primarily a statistical or research agency. The Bureau of Justice Statistics, in cooperation with the FBI, could begin experimenting with the early release of selected elements of the UCR, initially perhaps for a sample of large agencies with a history of high-quality crime recording and reliable transfer of the data up the line. For its part, the National Institute of Justice could support research on the data timeliness quality trade-offs. These would be baby steps in comparison with the impressive support given to the development of individual-level longitudinal data sets or field experiments in targeted policing. If they were taken, it would be up to those of us who devote our time to the study of the big picture to demonstrate that the intellectual and practical returns on these investments in macro-criminology more than justify the costs. The future of big-picture criminology and its policy relevance will not be secured with better crime data alone. As I've suggested, we need to build up the foundations of macro-criminology in other ways. Theories of the big picture based on systematic analyses of social institutions must be advanced. Empirical research to test and refine the theoretical developments must be conducted at the level of social systems and reveal the connections between system-level processes and the particulars of local milieu. Historical perspective is required to enlarge the explanatory scope of macro theory and research, even in studies of the present. But none of this will happen or last very long unless we introduce our students to the perspectives and methods of macro-criminology in the hopes of inspiring at least some of them to pursue the study of normal crime, social institutions, and history with the sense of intellectual excitement and discovery so many now bring to the study of the abnormal behavior of individuals in their immediate habitats. Thank you. All right. Now I have a real pleasure. Known this guy for a long time. We grew up together in this society. It's my pleasure and honor to hand the gavel over to Stephen F. Messner, who is the 2011 and now current President of the American Society of Criminology.
It gives me great pleasure to invite everyone to an institutionalized activity of this particular social system. That is the presidential reception, which I think is in the room to the right. I hope to see many of you there and in Washington, D.C. next year. And at the dance tonight. Session adjourned.
Huh? You keep it? You're going to take it home with you? It's got your name on it. I haven't had a single use for it during the last year, but I'm sure you can find something. Oh, that's the...
Very well done. You brought this.